Professor Ilan Pappe in South Africa for a nationwide tour hosted by Muslim Views and the BDS Movement South Africa is our guest tonight on ITV. Now, in the absence of the Israeli viewpoint, we will put to Professor Ilan Pappe some of the arguments put forward for the assault on Gaza, and we invite our audience and viewers to put their questions to Professor Ilan Pappe. For our viewers, we'll provide the Facebook address and Twitter handle in due course. Professor Ilan Pappe, shalom, marhaban.
I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you.
Our viewers will tonight experience something very different. A Jew, born in Israel, arguing against the state of Israel. This has made you a pariah in your own community. In fact, it has made you a traitor. What brought Ilan Pappe to this point in his life's journey?
It's a journey. I think most people who liberated themselves from ideologies that, in retrospect, were oppressive, racist, and immoral, know that it doesn't happen in one day. There isn't really an epiphany. There isn't really a moment of grace where you suddenly see things in a different way. It is a journey that you take, and each station takes you away from your mindset and perceptions, and the further you go from these perceptions, the more difficult it is to return to them. And there is one point where you know that you have crossed a certain Rubicon and there's no return. And I think that for me, these stations include intimate meetings with Palestinians, first and foremost. Israel is a segregated community. It's very difficult for Israeli Jews and Palestinians to meet on equal footing, to have an honest and genuine dialogue. For that to happen, you actually have to be in a different space. You have to leave the country for a while to be able to develop a different perspective of the Palestinians, first and foremost as human beings. Then to recognize the narrative, and finally to recognize the role of your own side in their narrative. For me, choosing to pursue my doctoral studies outside of Israel was a factor that brought me into a different kind of relationship with Palestinians. And the second aspect of such a journey, or second station in such a journey, is a willingness to reconnect, I think, with your universal values and humanity. And in a way, of course, I'm a flawed product of the Israeli educational system. I don't think I will be presented around the world as something the Israeli educational system is proud of. But they, in many ways, in my case, and the case of people like myself, they bear the fruits that they have planted, but they, I think, intended us to bloom in a different way. Because of the Israeli, at least alleged commitment to liberalism, democracy, equality, which of course is not practice in the case of Israel, but is being taught as supreme values, as important values, I think that I was one of the few who took them seriously. And I took these values and I examined my own society, my own state, and they failed the examination. And again, I could not do that examination inside Israel. It was too difficult. And I had to do it from the outside, and I had to do it as a professional historian. I needed facts, I needed archives, I needed documents, I needed rigorous scientific journey as well to accompany the personal journey. And finally, I think what people have to realize that for Israeli Jews to get out of the camp, to leave the tribe, if you want, is a very painful journey because we don't have any reference group once we do it. Palestinians and Israel, even if they are oppressed or occupied or colonized, have each other. The moment you leave the tribe in Israel, you are alone. You are alone even vis-a-vis your own parents, as happened in my case, and you are alone against your brothers and sisters. And I think the moment people like myself were able to connect to people outside of Israel, to realize that in the global community, you have friends, you have comrades, you have associates, and that your point of view is not either insane or treason, is a very empowering part of the journey. I think the last stations in this journey were helped very much by the recognition that around the world, anyone with a modicum of decency and humanity could not but stand with the Palestinians in the struggle for justice. So I do hope that other Israeli Jews in due course would take the same journey. Everybody's person is a different journey, but it's not an impossible journey. And I'm not alone, but we are still a handful of people who did it, and we need many, many more for the reality on the ground to change.
Talking about inviting others to take the position that you have, you could describe yourself as a dissident, an activist, but a dissident. What does it take, really, for an Israeli to undergo that transformation? Is Israel a safer place now than it was, say, 20, 30 years ago to express a critical opinion?
Well, I think it's almost best be described as a psychological issue more than anything else. It's relieving yourself, or releasing yourself, rather, from a society that manipulates fear on levels that I think are not recognized anywhere else in the world. It's a society that nurtures fears, indoctrinates you to be afraid, suspicious, alienated and alien, which justifies then everything you do. And the first thing I think that one has to do is to stop being afraid. And the only way of not being afraid of someone who is your neighbor but you don't know is to know him. I'll give you one example which I think illustrates best what I'm trying to say. I was involved in an attempt to create joint kindergartens and elementary schools in Israel for Palestinians and Jews.
But just coming back to your journey, in terms of, was it your Jewish faith? What part did that play in your transformation? And if it did play a part, why is that not really playing a part in transforming society as such?
Well, I think there are two versions of Judaism that have been developed since the appearance of Zionism as an ideology in the world. One is a very reduced, narrow version of Zionism as an ethnic national movement, a romantic kind of view of nationalism, where Judaism cannot survive and not thrive unless it is built in Palestine itself at the expense of the Palestinians. And there is a much wider universal sense of Judaism, which brought Jews to spearhead the civil rights movement in the southern United States, to be part of the struggle against apartheid, to be part of the struggle against Pinochet and against the Argentinian generals. This kind of Judaism puts humanity at the first place and not a narrow-minded perception. And I think that in many ways it is a distortion to call Israel a Jewish state. For me, Israel is not a non-Jewish state. It's a Zionist state, which is something very different, which is much more akin to apartheid. Is that if you would call apartheid a Christian state, and it would be wrong to call apartheid a Christian state, because Christianity has so many manifestations, or to call any oppressive state that uses Islam to oppress people an Islamic state. The monotheistic religions are much wider, much more inclusive, much richer than being reduced into the narrow idea of nationalism or ethnicity. We deserve much more as people who are inspired by our religious heritage, by our commitment, than to reduce or translate our religious faith into an ideology that justifies oppression, colonization, and dispossession. And Judaism does not have to be that kind of religion, nor was it until the appearance of Zionism.
We thank you, Professor, for giving us an insight, I think, to very personal insight. When we get back, we'll look at some of the pressing questions. We're looking at history. You are a historian, an activist historian, so we want to look at the history and what has brought us to this point, and, of course, the current conflict. And I will invite our audience to prepare the questions. I already have one question for you, Professor, so I'll put that to you later, and then the Facebook address and Twitter handles will appear on screen. So do send us your questions, and we invite the audience to participate.
Thank you.
And welcome back to our discussion. We are in discussion with Professor Ilan Pappe, an Israeli historian, world-renowned, and one who has been described as a traitor in Israel, but seen by many as a brave activist historian. We want to look at background first, Professor, and I know people are eager to learn your perspective and your analysis of what's happening currently. But I think I want to start off with a very fundamental question, which in fact has come from the audience, and something that you referred to when you said that Israel cannot be described as a Jewish state, but it is a Zionist state. Give us a brief background about Zionism, its origins, and how has it really developed into what it is now?
Right. I think Zionism started out of two noble impulses, one should say, in Central and Eastern Europe. Jews felt unsafe in the mid-19th century and in the end of the 19th century, for good reasons, as we know. And were looking for safer places to settle in because they did not feel secure in their own home countries. So that was one impulse that created the idea of looking for a different homeland from the one that they had. The second impulse was to redefine Judaism as a national movement because so many other ethnic and religious groups in Europe in the mid-19th century and later on defined themselves in terms of this new ideology of nationalism. The problem with Zionism began when it chose, after debating several other locations in the world, it chose Palestine as the space in which to implement these two impulses, namely to create a safer place and to reinvent themselves as a national movement. Something, by the way, that most of the Jews in the world rejected, but something which evangelical leaders of the churches, leaders of the evangelical churches, especially in Britain, endorsed for their own reasons. They saw the return of the Jews to Palestine as precipitating the second coming of the Messiah and part of a divine scheme. And in fact, they exerted strong pressure on the Zionist movement not to look for other locations. For their own religious reasons, they wanted the Jews to go to Palestine. So the moment Zionism was connected so strongly to imperial British interests on the one hand, and chose a land which was already inhabited by another people, it turned from an ideology of salvage into an ideology of colonization. And from that moment onwards, the preoccupation of the Zionist movement was not with saving Jews, as was clearly shown in the very meager efforts they have done to save Jews during the Second World War, during the Nazi Holocaust. Their main preoccupation was with the native indigenous people of Palestine. So if you are an ideological movement which is all the time disturbed by the presence of the indigenous people, you become an ideology that may have great achievements in many other aspects of life, and Zionism did have major achievements in other aspects of life, but it all depends on your ability to get rid, frankly, of the indigenous people of Palestine. So Zionism, for me, from the 1930s onwards, and especially today, is an ideology which is focused on creating a supremacist, exclusive Jewish society all over historical Palestine.
Just looking at the term Zionist, I find it very interesting. There are times when you refer, if one is a critic, and you say, the Zionist project, for example, it's almost seen by the Zionists as an offensive term. Can you just speak that?
Yes, that's an interesting paradox. When Zionists talk about Zionism, it's a noble, positive ideology. If I will talk about the Zionists as being Zionists, they would say, you're a self-hating Jew. It's very interesting. It's one of the indicators of the paradoxes Israeli Jews live in. They know that in their internal conversation, they use terminology which would be condemned outside of Israel as unacceptable on moral grounds. For instance, they talk about colonization as a religious imperative, as a national interest, but they understand that you cannot present it as such to the world. So you don't talk about colonization, you talk about settlement or habitation or construction projects. Israel has the biggest laundrette of words that the world has ever seen. And it's overworked, and it stopped working a long time ago, to my mind. Assassinations are targeted killings. Occupation is an enlightened takeover. And the branding of the Palestinians as terrorists has nothing to do with the Palestinian actions. It has to do with their unfortunate location in the space coveted by the Zionist movement as a space for survival and thriving. And they are looked as the worst hurdle or the most formidable hurdle for both existence and progressing and thriving.
We'll take a question from the audience, and I think we have someone.
The name is Liaquat. What I would like to know is, what is the total population of the Jews in Israel, and what percentage is the Zionists? And also, outside Israel, what is the same percentage of Jews as well as the Zionists? And is there any attempt by the Jews to overthrow the Zionists at any stage? Because it affects them also during this period of time.
Thank you. I have a problem in answering some of these questions because since the age of Wikipedia, I don't try to remember anymore the numbers of Jews in Israel, or for that matter, the number of Jews in the United States. So do check my figures afterwards. I do beseech you. I think there are today about 6.5 million Jews in Israel. But again, do check it. And I think there is an equal number of Jews around the world. Your second part of the question is easier to answer because it is not statistics, which I don't try to remember anymore in my advanced age. So it's a very difficult question to answer, only in the sense that this is a dynamic situation. As we speak, Jews are distancing themselves from Zionism. You are talking about a process which is happening as we speak. So it would be unwise of me to try and assess how significant it is before we can see its progress. But one thing is very clear. One thing is very clear. The young Jewish generation around the world, in greater numbers than ever before, disassociates itself from Zionism. They don't want to be associated with Israel or what Israel is doing. It doesn't mean necessarily that they will put themselves at the forefront of the struggle against Zionism, but they definitely do not want to serve as ambassadors or ambassadress for Zionism. And that's a very important fact that even Israel recognizes. One of the implications of this recognition is a very honest statement by Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, who said that Israeli policy in the United States relies now much more on Christian Zionists than on the Jewish public. He said, we cannot trust the Jewish community as we could in the past. The Christian Zionist community is far more trustworthy as a pillar of support for the state of Israel. And that gives you an indication that the Jewish communities around the world will not be in the future the foundation on which Israel would be able to base its international support. Thank you.
Just picking up on that question, is the question... Okay, I'll take one question from the audience before we go for the break. We've got 3 minutes, so please keep your questions brief, and I'll ask the Professor to respond.
Thank you very much. Mine's going to be very brief. Thank you. You spoke about Christian support for the state of Israel. But I'm very interested in Muslim complicity of the Arab states, Saudis. Just today, I think the New York Times was boasting that Egypt and Saudi Arabia particularly, and the other monarchies, have deserted Palestine. They're absolutely alone. We watch this carnage and we wonder what's going to happen tomorrow. That would be a huge hindering factor. The other thing that I just wanted to mention is that the Israeli argument, the Zionist argument recently, is more about we've built an oasis in the desert, we've produced so many Nobel laureates, what have the Muslims done? Now, to what extent can we argue back and say it's a human rights issue? It's not about your success in this material world. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor, if I can, sorry to interrupt your response, but it's a kind of multi-layered question, so I suppose you would appreciate the ad break to think about it, and when we come back, Professor will respond to your question. And can I just ask you if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself when you pose the question? That was Professor Anwar Mawal. We'll come back, we'll give you your response, Professor rather will give you a response immediately after the break. Thank you. And welcome back to our discussion with Professor Ilan Pappe, a noted historian and activist from Israel, but now lecturing in the United Kingdom. I just want to remind viewers who may have tuned in just after our introduction that this was meant to be a debate. We invited the pro-Israel lobby spokesperson, the South African Board of Jewish Deputies, as well as the South African Zionist Federation. And in fact, until about 2 hours before the program, we contacted the South African Union of Jewish Students. And before I ask you to respond to Professor Anwar Mal's question. There is another question that's linked to that. But can you just respond to the non-appearance of of invited guests?
Yes, I have to stress that I was very willing, without any conditions, without any strings attached, to debate whoever was willing to debate me. But I must say it's a global phenomenon. And I think that I know the reason now, because I once debated, which probably was the last time anyone from Israel debated me outside of Israel. I once debated the Israeli consul in New York. And he said to the audience that I'm a dangerous people because I believe Israel should be a democracy. It's very difficult to construct a response to this that makes sense to people who are not Zionists. So I think it's very difficult to win the argument if you come with an agenda which is not violent, is democratic, is pluralistic, is inclusive. In the 21st century, countering this agenda with talk about exclusivity, supremacy, exclusion, and colonization in an open debate is not a very easy task. It's much easier to do it in Israel, where I stopped being interviewed because it looks more like a field marshal, a field court, than an interview. So I'm very sorry about it, because I think these issues have to be debated. I take very seriously the Israeli counter-arguments. I don't brush them aside as stupid or unacceptable. I want to engage with them. It says something about these arguments when they are not being freely displayed or not willingly displayed in a free space and environment.
Perhaps later in the program I would act as your interlocutor, so that may still come up, the Israeli viewpoint. Just by, not my viewpoint, but certainly just express that what one reads and the kind of narrative that comes through the mainstream media. On to Professor Anwar Mal, I beg your pardon, Professor Anwar Mal's question. There's one, I think I would just add this, it comes via Twitter from Ahmed Ismail, and he, in similar veins, asks, why are the Arab states so quiet on the issue? When are they going to stand up against Zionism? And of course, Professor Anwar Mal talking about the complicity of the states around Israel.
Yeah. I think that, of course, this is a question the people in those countries should ask themselves. I should not be their guide or a prophet on this. As an historian, I'm very much aware of this complicity and silence. But I think it's part of the overall problem of the Arab regimes. To construct a moral position towards all these issues, see the interconnection, and therefore I do believe that the next projects of liberation will be far better in this respect. One amazing and illuminating indication of that fusion of the struggle for liberation in Palestine, the struggle for decent wages in the United States, the struggle for accommodation in South Africa. The one thing that brought it together was the fact that in almost any demonstration in the world against any kind of injustice, including on the basis of industrial relations, people waved high and strong the Palestinian flag. I witnessed it myself in places where the crisis in question had nothing to do with Palestine, where people felt that in order to accentuate their demands for justice, they need the Palestinian flag to put across the idea that they are fighting for something which is bigger than their own cause. So I think South Africa has shown us the way forward, and the fact that many issues have not been yet resolved, at least for us in Palestine, maybe less for you here in South Africa, does not dim your achievement. For us, it's still a very powerful achievement which we would like to follow up. And yes, of course, we would like to avoid the pitfalls that you are still suffering from and hope that this would not occur in our case. But do remember, we are not there yet, even with your achievement, as much as you probably rightly so criticize them.
Thank you, Professor. We'll take... Thank you. We'll take one more question from my left, member of the audience. There we go.
Good evening. The name is Kashif Wickham. Professor, the Palestinian national struggle is probably, in my view, at an all-time high and at its peak. My fear is that if we as activists and the global community do not push what is probably more a mass emotion into action, we may have a huge opportunity loss for the next couple of years. I don't know how long. So the question is, what can we as citizens do vis-a-vis the issue of Palestine and vis-a-vis our own governments globally?
Yeah, thank you. I think, first of all, I agree with you. I think we are experiencing in history in general, and the history of Palestine in particular, certain tipping points that we could have acted upon and we missed them. And I think you're right, 2014 is one such tipping point that could change the reality in Palestine, but could be easily missed as well. So I totally agree with you. And it's a huge question, what can be done so that this opportunity is not going to be exhausted or missed? I think the first thing to do is to identify what disables us from being effective. And the answer, to my mind, is our inability to translate a very strong public impulse about Palestine into governmental policies, including here in South Africa. And the question is, why do we fail, even in systems which are allegedly democratic, to convey to our politicians that if they are really democratic, they should reflect our positions on Palestine and not act in total contradiction to what we want them to do on Palestine. And I think that we have to find a way of putting across the message, that the only message that politicians can understand, that there is a political price to be paid for not acting on Palestine. Whether it is a constituency that would not elect you back to the parliament, whether it is a party member that would not give you his personal vote if you want to be elevated to a position of a minister or a prime minister, or whether it is a constant pressuring and lobbying on you, not in one day, and not only when Gaza is massacred, throughout the year, that you demand your right as a citizen to be represented on Palestine as on any other important issue. Now, I'm not saying this only abstractly and theoretically. I saw for myself in the late 1970s how this tipping point worked in the case of South Africa. As you probably know, the anti-apartheid movement in Europe was not started by politicians. It was started actually by two shopkeepers in Dublin, in Ireland, two very brave women who refused to work on the till for an Irish lady who had too many South African goods in her trolley. And they were sacked. And then all their sisters resigned the day after. It took 21 years from that action to the first European government to decide to impose sanctions on South Africa. I think we are not 21 years away from this. I think we are 1 year away from this if we will act correctly. Because we already have much more than shopkeepers in Dublin who support us. We need to find the first brave minister, the first brave prime minister who would say, we are moving from boycott to sanctions. So we should focus on that and not waste any energy on providing platforms for Jews and Arabs to meet, what I call the kissing cousins industry. We don't need you in South Africa to meet. We don't need you to kiss each other. We need you for only one thing now in South Africa. Turn Israel into a pariah state. That's the only thing we need.
Thank you, Professor, for that response. And on the question of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, I have a number of questions, in fact, and there's one question questioning the position of the South African government. So when we get back, I want to get through most of the, and preferably all of these questions, and we'll take questions from the audience. So I'll run through them very quickly when we get back. Thank you. And welcome back to our discussion with noted historian and activist, Professor Ilan Pappe. We've received a number of questions, and I really want to go through most of them, and so I'll run through them very, very quickly. But before we do that, we'll take the last question from a member of the audience.
Thank you. My name is Soli. Professor Pappe, Shalom. Farid, Salam Alaikum. I think you are definitely on the right train, and don't worry about the next station because you've liberated yourself. I think as a South African, I'm very proud. We're liberated, we're free, we have the freedoms, and whatever we lack, we'll sort out. But we are truly free people to talk what we want to. You have elucidated a lot on what has happened and how they've cleansed the Palestinian. You said there were 3 defining moments. It had nothing to do with the Holocaust, but it was in 1948, 1967, and 2014. Just for the people quickly, if you can just go back to that and tell them exactly what you said and why it's happened. And then also, if you would agree with me, that why the Christian world always is with the Zionists is because they are the ones that killed the 6 million Jews, and it's very easy to pass the blame to others by having the guilt factor.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, indeed. I think you're right in pointing to the first 2 formative periods, 1948 and 1967, and hopefully, for good reasons, we will remember 2014. 1948 was, in fact, the year in which the old or older Zionist ideas of how to turn Palestine from an Arab country into a Jewish country have been implemented. The ideas were there from the very beginning of the Zionist presence in Palestine, but it was only in 1948 that the opportune moment came and this idea could be translated into a program. And the reason that 1948 was the year that this could have happened is because, firstly, a British rule over Palestine ended, and as much as we in Palestine remember with quite critical eyes the British presence in Palestine, and for good reasons, we should also remember that as long as there were the rulers of Palestine, the Zionist movement was unable to cleanse Palestine from its original population. The moment the British rule ended, the door was opened for the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. The second reason that 48 was such an opportune moment was indeed something else you have mentioned. The fact that Europe was looking desperately for a way of dealing with the crimes it has committed against the Jewish people during the Holocaust. And Zionism provided the best outlet from dealing genuinely and seriously with a period in which European enlightenment brought with it such a death machine as Germany did, not only against the Jews, but against millions and millions of European citizens. Zionism absolved Europe and Germany from dealing genuinely with their own crimes by saying, if you support the dispossession of Palestine by the Zionist movement would tell the world that there's a new Germany and a new Europe, and we, as the representative of the Jewish people, absolve you from any need to search deep in your heart to ask yourself, how can you call yourself the epitome of civilization if 3 years ago you have committed some of the worst crimes against humanity? And this deal still works on. And the third reason, already mentioned in this debate today, the Arab world's engagement with other issues, especially the anti-colonial struggle of their own, enabled the Zionist movement to ethnically cleanse, which means to expel half of Palestine's population, destroy half of Palestine's villages, and demolish half of Palestine towns. It's a tragedy that the peace process that began in the 1970s always ignores the importance of 1948. Very briefly, in 1967, Israel occupied the 20% of Palestine it failed to occupy in 1948. And with it, it incorporated the same number of Palestinians it has expelled in 1948. So in order to solve the issue of another 1 million or 1.5 million Palestinians, it devised ethnic cleansing in other means. In 1948, it was massive expulsion. In 1967, it built a mega prison for the people of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip as an alternative solution for expelling them. This is the basic Israeli strategy. This is the kind of policy that is not being reported in the Western media and in the West, and not analyzed by the Western academia. We should insist on that history, and then everything falls into place, including the Palestinian resistance, its failed or more justified ways of resisting. But one would not doubt the right of the Palestinians to resist if you understand what they have been facing ever since 1948. The European ability to deal with the Jewish question would help us a lot, because only two movements in the world don't want to see Jews in Europe: the anti-Semitic movements and the Zionist movement. So we need a different approach. Gaza is just a big urban neighborhood. There is no rural areas. There's no countryside in Gaza. So you can only resist from the urban space. Now, of course, when you resist from the urban space, you resist from within the civilian population. But if you don't resist from within the civilian population, then you continue to be subjected to a policy of siege, strangulation, and starvation. And the world has to offer the Hamas and the people of Gaza an alternative way to end not just a siege of 5 years, but a siege that began on the year that you were liberated from apartheid in 1994. And this siege, we have to understand, includes even calculating how many calories each person in Gaza is allowed to consume so as to live, but not to live too well, in order to feel the boot of Israel on their face. So the question is not about the Hamas tactics. It's not about the Hamas use of force. The question is, do we offer the Hamas and the people of Gaza an alternative for the slow starvation and strangulation that Israel has imposed on them ever since 1994? If we don't offer them an alternative, if we don't find an international way of stopping that, we cannot blame them for trying to do it, even if this does not seem to my mind to work. And I am, as a pacifist, I'm not a great believer in any use of armed force for liberation. But one has to understand that people act according to the alternatives they have. And if they have nothing to lose and are pushed to the back, what do you expect them to do?
That question, by the way, came from Jamia Khaland, who's added another question also related to Hamas. And could you comment on the extent to which Hamas engages with Christians or other faith-based Palestinian organizations?
Yes. There is an accusation that the Hamas is policies that either damn or kill or wound or cause Christians to leave or to be living in a worse condition than they lived before. I saw no evidence for that. I'm not a Hamas spokesman, nor do I endorse everything that the Hamas stands for. But I think that this constant Israeli attempt to claim that there is a difference between Christians and Muslims within the Palestinian community has never worked and is not going to work. This is an old divide and rule colonialist tactic to try and show one community that it would be better for them to adopt a different kind of identity in order to weaken their resistance and resolve. I think that none of the Palestinian political factions I know discriminate against anyone because of their religion. And the Palestinian national movement from the very beginning talked about a state in which all religions would be respected and in which everyone would enjoy democratic rights. As I said before, for Israeli Zionists, the vision of a democratic Palestine is an act of treason, or anybody who supports it is either a terrorist if he's a Palestinian or is a traitor if he's an Israeli Jew.
A final question to you, Professor, and I think it has come through in many of the questions that have actually been addressed, the BDS movement, etc. The South African government, the position that the South African government has adopted, what is your response to the position taken by the South African government in the current crisis?
Yes. I think, as I mentioned it before, maybe it was before we went live on air, that people in Palestine and progressive people in Israel were disappointed by the South African response so far. I think we expected the government at least to follow the Argentinian and Brazilian example of recalling the ambassadors, or maybe even go as far as Venezuela and severe diplomatic ties. There are many ways in showing, for governments to show diplomatic outrage when policies which remind us of apartheid South Africa are being enacted all the time of Israel's existence, and particularly in this year. So I still hope that the South African government would at least find one of these many means possible, or ways possible, to show us its outrage and its condemnation of the carnage of Palestine.
تبسم